They thought stealing my water would be easy. They were wrong. HOA president shows up at 6 a.m. with a construction crew, starts ripping through my family's ranch like she owns the place. Your little cow pasture doesn't get to hold up progress, she sneers, waving legal papers in my face. But here's what Karen and Chief didn't know. That worthless spring my grandfather left me? It feeds their entire luxury subdivision. Every shower, every swimming pool, every perfectly manicured lawn, all my water. What would you do if your HOA started stealing your family's land in broad daylight? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. The story's about to get wild. My name's Jake Morrison, and I inherited 40 acres of prime ranch land from my grandfather in 2019. Nothing fancy, just rolling pasture, a natural spring that's been flowing since before Colorado was a state, and enough room for 50 head of cattle. The kind of place where you can still hear coyotes at night and smell leather from your work gloves mixed with morning coffee. Grandpa bought this land in 1952 for $800 and a handshake. Back then, our nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Fast forward to today, and I'm surrounded by Whispering Pines Estates, a luxury subdivision where the cheapest house costs more than I'll make in 10 years. These aren't your typical rural neighbors. We're talking about folks who moved out here for the authentic ranch experience, but call the county every time my cattle make noise during calving season. The irony tastes more bitter than burnt coffee. They wanted rural charm until they actually got it. The problems started small. Noise complaints when I'd run equipment before 7 a.m. Formal letters about unsightly hay storage. One particularly memorable incident involved a woman demanding I install air fresheners on my cattle because the smell was affecting her yoga sessions. I wish I was making that up. But the real trouble began when Patricia Patty Blackwood became HOA president. Picture every nightmare boss you've ever had, add a law degree and unlimited free time, then give her authority over 847 families. Patty's 55, lives in the biggest house overlooking my ranch, and has turned harassment into an art form. Her husband Rick owns Blackwood Development, the company that built half the subdivisions in the county. Together, they're like a 2-person wrecking crew for anyone who doesn't fit their vision of community standards. Patty's signature move? Showing up at your door with a thick stack of official-looking papers, speaking in legal jargon designed to intimidate. The sound of her designer heels clicking on marble floors became my personal horror movie soundtrack. The harassment escalated over 5 years. First came the letters, typed on expensive letterhead, threatening legal action over everything from my truck's parking angle to the height of my fence posts. Then came the formal complaints, noise violations, zoning disputes, even a claim that my cattle were depressing property values through visual pollution. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real war started 3 months ago when I discovered those surveyor marks running straight across my best pasture. Not along the property line, directly through the middle of my land, connecting the subdivision's new clubhouse to the county water main 2 miles away. When I knocked on Patty's door that morning, I could smell the sprinkler system hitting her perfectly manicured lawn. She answered wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, holding a stack of documents thick enough to stop a bullet. "Oh, Jake," she said, like she was greeting a persistent door-to-door salesman. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." "Figure what out, Patty? That you're running a pipeline across my land without permission?" She smiled, the kind of smile a shark gives a wounded fish. "Right of necessity, sweetie. Your little cow pasture doesn't get to hold up progress for 847 families. We've got all the legal authority we need." She thrust those papers at me, and I'll admit, they looked impressive. Official seals, legal terminology, the works. But as I'd soon discover, looking official and being legal are two very different things. The texture of that expensive paper stock should have been my first clue. Real legal documents don't need premium printing to carry weight. That conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it changed everything. Because what Patty didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Grandpa's inheritance included more than just 40 acres of pasture. Monday morning, 6 a.m. sharp, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines rumbling across my pasture. Not the gentle hum of a pickup truck, the deep, earth-shaking growl of a full excavation crew setting up shop on my land. I threw on boots and jogged out to find 5 guys in hard hats trenching a 4-foot-deep pipeline directly through my prime grazing area. The foreman, a weathered guy named Carlos, looked as uncomfortable as I felt. "Morning," I called out, trying to keep my voice level. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my property?" Carlos wiped sweat from his forehead and handed me a county permit. "Got orders to run water line from the subdivision to the main. Permit says we're good to go." I scanned the document, official county seal, proper signatures, the works. But here's the thing about bureaucratic paperwork. It's only as good as the property description, and this one was intentionally vague. Instead of specifying easement along northern boundary, it just said necessary access through adjacent properties. That's when I learned my first legal lesson. Always demand to see the exact property survey attached to any permit. A legitimate easement will have precise measurements and clearly marked boundaries. If they're being vague about location, they're probably being dishonest about authority. The diesel fumes were making my eyes water as I watched these guys tear up 5 years of careful pasture management. My cattle were scattered to the far corner of the property, spooked by the noise and activity. Worse yet, the trenching was already turning my crystal clear spring water muddy brown. "Look, Carlos, I'm sure you're just doing your job, but nobody asked my permission for this." He shrugged apologetically. "Take it up with the county, man. I just dig where they tell me." Fair enough, but while I was calling my attorney, Patty was already 3 moves ahead. By noon, I had an emergency injunction filed through the only lawyer in town who'd take my case, a semi-retired guy named Bob who mostly handled wills and divorces. Not exactly a heavyweight, but he was honest and cheap. The injunction would stop construction, but the court hearing wasn't scheduled for 3 weeks. That's when I discovered the beauty of small-town legal warfare. Construction can continue pending resolution of disputes. Convenient, right? But I'm not completely naive. Growing up on a ranch teaches you to prepare for trouble, so I'd already set up trail cameras along the property line after finding those surveyor marks. Nothing fancy, just the kind hunters use to track deer movement, but they record everything in high definition. I spent that afternoon posting no trespassing signs every 20 feet along the pipeline route. Probably overkill, but I wanted crystal clear documentation that this was private property. The twist came during dinner. My daughter Emma, she's 16 and way smarter than me about most things, was doing homework at the kitchen table when my phone rang. "Dad," she said, looking up from her laptop, "I've been researching this water rights stuff for my civics project. Did you know that if they permanently lower the pressure in our spring, the ranch becomes unsuitable for cattle?" I hadn't thought about that, but she was right. Without reliable water, I'd have to sell the herd. Without the herd, the ranch becomes just expensive hobby property I can't afford to maintain. Emma overheard me talking to Bob later that night. "Honey, we might have to sell if this goes badly." The look on her face broke my heart. This land represents 4 generations of family history, and now some suburban power couple was trying to steal it with fancy paperwork and legal intimidation. But Patty wasn't done. 2 days later, she filed a counter-complaint claiming I was disrupting essential infrastructure and endangering public health by interfering with the pipeline construction. The woman had brass, I'll give her that. Then came the whisper campaign. Patty organized an emergency HOA meeting where she painted me as the villain holding up progress. According to the meeting minutes Emma found online, I was now an environmental hazard whose industrial agriculture practices were threatening property values. The local newspaper, a weekly rag that survives mostly on real estate ads, ran a story titled "Rancher versus Progress, Old Ways Block Community Growth." They used a photo of my property taken during the worst part of calving season, making it look like a disaster zone. But here's what Patty didn't count on. Emma's generation doesn't get their news from newspapers. She started documenting everything on TikTok, and suddenly we had a few thousand people following our story. The sound of hydraulic hammers breaking through shale became the soundtrack to viral videos about property rights. Sometimes the best defense is just showing people what's really happening. Patty's next move came disguised as community concern. 3 weeks after the pipeline drama started, a guy in a white coat and clipboard showed up at my gate claiming to be an environmental consultant hired by the HOA to test my property for contamination. "Standard procedure," he said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses that screamed, "Trust me, I'm a scientist. Just need to collect some soil and water samples to ensure your cattle operations aren't posing health risks to the community." The smell of his cologne mixed with morning dew created this weird chemical cocktail that should have been my first warning sign. Real environmental scientists don't bathe in aftershave before collecting samples. Dr. Gerald Hoffman, that's what his business card said, Spent 4 hours taking pictures of every mud puddle, manure pile, and water trough on my property. He was particularly interested in photographing the spring from unflattering angles, making crystal clear water look contaminated through creative camera work. 2 weeks later, his preliminary findings hit the county health department like a bombshell. According to Dr. Hoffman's report, cattle runoff from my ranch posed significant health risks to the subdivision's water supply. Never mind that his water samples came from a puddle next to my equipment barn, not the actual spring. The county issued a formal investigation notice, suspending all ranch operations pending comprehensive environmental review. Suddenly, I couldn't move cattle, spread hay, or basically do anything that looked like ranching while they decided whether my family's 70-year operation was a public menace. But here's where Rick's greed started showing. The same week my operations got suspended, Blackwood Development coincidentally submitted a bid to remediate my environmental problems through property purchase, for about half what the land was worth, naturally. That's when I started staying up nights, diving deep into county records and HOA incorporation documents. If you've never tried researching property law at 2 a.m., fueled by coffee and righteous anger, I don't recommend it. But sometimes, insomnia pays off. Turns out Whispering Pines was built on a former mining claim. Those beautiful rolling hills, they used to be a copper mining operation that was filled in during the 1980s. The more I dug, the more interesting things got. Environmental consultant licenses are public record, and Dr. Hoffman's had expired 2 years ago. His environmental testing company was actually a shell corporation owned by Surprise Rick's development company. The man testing my property for contamination was literally on my enemy's payroll. Here's a knowledge nugget that could save you thousands in legal fees. Always verify professional licenses through state databases before accepting any official-sounding reports. Expired credentials are a red flag that usually means someone's trying to intimidate you with fake authority. I gathered all this evidence and presented it to the county health department. Within 48 hours, their investigation was quietly dropped. Funny how quickly bureaucrats lose interest when you prove their expert witness is a fraud. But here's the kicker. My water well tests came back cleaner than the subdivision city water supply. My contaminated ranch had better water quality than their fancy homes. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a hay knife. Of course, the pipeline construction never stopped during my suspension. Those diesel engines kept rumbling across my pasture every morning, tearing up more land while I fought paperwork battles. Patty, desperate to control the narrative, organized a neighborhood safety meeting about ranch dangers. She invited the local news station to document hazardous conditions and hired a professional photographer to capture my property from the worst possible angles. The Facebook campaign she launched was a masterpiece of suburban hysteria. Protect our children from industrial agriculture. Photos of normal ranch equipment made to look like environmental disasters. Testimonials from neighbors about strange smells and dangerous chemicals, also known as hay and cattle feed. But Emma's TikTok documentation was gaining traction faster than Patty's Facebook fear-mongering. Young people don't buy into manufactured outrage as easily as their parents. When you show actual footage of clean water and healthy cattle, it's hard to sell the environmental disaster narrative. I started connecting with other property owners through online forums, and that's when things got really interesting. Turns out 3 other families in the county were facing similar utility easement seizures from Rick's company. Same playbook, questionable permits, environmental scare tactics, lowball purchase offers. Margaret Chen, a retired environmental lawyer from Denver, reached out after seeing Emma's videos. She'd handled cases like mine before and was willing to work pro bono because she'd grown up on a ranch herself. Rick's using regulatory capture, she explained during our first phone call. He gets his former business partners appointed to oversight positions, then uses their authority to legitimize land grabs. The county inspector who'd approved all those pipeline permits, Rick's former business partner turned public official, the whole system was rigged from the start. By month 2 of this circus, Patty had apparently decided subtlety was overrated. She filed a formal eminent domain petition claiming the pipeline served public necessity. Translation, she was asking the government to legally steal my land because her husband's development company needed the water. The smell of desperation was stronger than the manure pile behind my barn. Margaret explained that eminent domain requires proving genuine public benefit, not private profit. But Patty had brought in heavy artillery. 3 city council members who owed their campaigns to Rick's donations started threatening to annex my ranch property. Suddenly, my rural land would be subject to city zoning laws designed for suburban subdivisions. Maybe can't legally force a cattle ranch to comply with residential building codes, Margaret assured me, but they can make your life miserable while you fight it in court. While I was dealing with legal paperwork, Patty hired a private investigator to dig through my finances. Nothing quite says community leader like paying someone to spy on your neighbors. This PI, a sketchy guy who looked like he'd been kicked out of mall security, started interviewing my suppliers, my bank, even Emma's teachers. Then came the really low blow. Patty started spreading rumors that I was an unfit parent because of my unstandable lifestyle. According to the HOA gossip network, raising a teenager on a working ranch was somehow child endangerment. But while Patty was playing dirty tricks, Margaret was teaching me the fine art of legal detective work. We discovered that Rick's company had $2,300,000, 0 cents in unpaid contractor liens from previous projects. Turns out building luxury subdivisions is easier than actually paying for them. Even better, Margaret's environmental lawyer friend found evidence that Rick had used illegal fill dirt in the subdivision construction. That beautiful landscaping was sitting on top of construction debris that should have been disposed of properly. The same guy accusing me of environmental contamination had literally built his project on buried trash. Emma, meanwhile, had become our unofficial intelligence officer. Her social media investigation revealed that Patty had pulled similar stunts in 2 previous neighborhoods before moving to Colorado. Everywhere she lived, mysteriously, property disputes erupted and small landowners ended up selling to development companies. But the real game changer came during one of my late-night research sessions. I was going through Grandpa's old papers, deeds, mineral rights, water rights, all the boring stuff you inherit with land, when I found something that made my coffee go cold. My grandfather's mineral rights included the water rights to the natural spring. Not just the spring on my property, the entire underground source that fed into the aquifer beneath the whole area. According to a 1,960s geological survey, my spring was the primary water source for everything within a 5-mile radius, including Whispering Pines subdivision. Here's a knowledge nugget that could change your life. In Western water law, the doctrine of prior appropriation means first users have superior rights to later users. My grandfather had been using that water since 1952. The subdivision was built in 2018. Guess who wins that legal battle? Margaret nearly dropped her phone when I told her, "Jake, you don't just own the water on your property, you own the water under their property too." Meanwhile, Patty was escalating to nuclear options. She filed a complaint with Child Protective Services claiming the ranch was an unsafe environment for Emma. She organized a traffic blockade that prevented my feed deliveries. Rick's crew accidentally cut my phone and internet lines twice in 1 week. The taste of dust from their construction equipment seemed to coat everything now, a constant reminder that they were tearing up my land while I fought their paperwork war. But I'd learned something about strategic patience from watching my grandfather deal with difficult neighbors over the years. Sometimes the best move is to let your enemy dig their own grave while you quietly prepare your response. I started documenting every harassment incident with timestamps and photos, set up redundant communication systems, satellite, internet, ham radio, even carrier pigeons would have been more reliable than dealing with Rick's maintenance crews. Most importantly, I began researching water rights law like my livelihood depended on it, because it did. The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. Rick's company had been selling guaranteed water access to new subdivision buyers for years. But with the county water table dropping 40% due to overbuilding, he was promising water he didn't have legal access to. Emma found the smoking gun buried in public records. Rick owed $4,200,000, 0 cents in water utility bonds coming due in 18 months. The subdivision residents were paying premium prices for unlimited water access, but without my spring water, they'd face severe usage restrictions. The vibration of my phone buzzing with legal notifications had become as familiar as my morning alarm, but for the first time since this started, those notifications might actually be good news. Because I was starting to realize something Patty and Rick hadn't figured out yet. When you control the source, you control everything downstream. 3 months into this legal nightmare, I was sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., surrounded by water rights documents and county records, when the pieces finally clicked together. The sound of my ancient coffee maker gurgling was the only thing breaking the silence as I stared at a stack of papers that would change everything. Margaret had helped me dig deeper into the county water records, and what we found was absolutely mind-blowing. Rick's development company hadn't just been promising water access to new subdivisions, they'd been selling guaranteed unlimited water rights as a premium feature to justify those $800,000 0 cents price tags. But here's the problem. The county water table had dropped 40% in the past decade due to overbuilding. Rick had been writing checks his aquifer couldn't cash. The real bombshell was buried in the subdivision's original utility contracts. Those permanent water rights Rick had been selling, they were actually temporary agreements that expired in exactly 18 months, and when they expired, Rick's company would owe $4,200,000 0 cents in water utility bonds to the county. Think about that for a second. 847 families had bought premium homes based on water access that was about to disappear. Their property values were built on a lie that was going to explode in less than 2 years. But wait, it gets better. My spring water, the stuff flowing from my grandfather's land, currently provided 60% of the subdivision's summer water usage. Without my spring, those luxury homes would face severe usage restrictions. We're talking brown lawns, limited showers, and property values dropping faster than a lead balloon. Margaret walked me through the legal implications over coffee that morning. Jake, under prior appropriation doctrine, your grandfather's 1952 water rights supersede everything Rick built. You can legally cut off their water access immediately. The power shift was staggering. For months, I'd been playing defense against HOA harassment and legal intimidation. Suddenly, I realized I'd been holding all the cards without knowing it. But with great power comes great responsibility and some serious moral complexity. If I cut off water access completely, I wouldn't just be hurting Patty and Rick. 847 families would suffer for their leaders' illegal actions. Kids would lose their homes. Elderly neighbors on fixed incomes would see their life savings evaporate. Emma, who'd been following this saga better than most adults, put it perfectly. Dad, we can't fight monsters by becoming monsters ourselves. She was right, but that didn't mean we had to roll over and let Rick steal our land. The vulnerability in Patty's position was now crystal clear. Her own house had a $200,000 0 cents second mortgage based on projected property values that depended on water access. If the subdivision faced water restrictions, her personal finances would collapse along with everyone else's. Rick's company was already facing bankruptcy if those water contracts failed. 3 major development projects had been canceled due to water access uncertainty. The man who'd tried to steal my land was drowning in his own greed. I had 3 options: cut off the water immediately and bankrupt the entire subdivision, negotiate a water usage agreement with appropriate compensation, or find a third option that would deliver justice without destroying innocent people's lives. The environmental damage from their illegal pipeline gave me additional legal standing. Criminal charges were possible for trespassing and water theft, but criminal justice wouldn't help the families who'd been lied to about their water rights. As I sat there surrounded by legal documents, watching the sun rise through my kitchen window, I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about finding a solution that would hold the bad actors accountable while protecting the innocent people caught in their web of lies. The taste of victory was within reach, but it needed to be the right kind of victory. The next morning, I called Margaret with a proposition that would either make me look like a genius or land me in financial ruin. What if we don't just fight them? What if we buy them out? Margaret's coffee mug clinked against her desk as she processed what I was suggesting. You want to purchase Rick's water contracts? Jake, we're talking about millions of dollars. Hear me out. Rick's desperate. His company's bleeding money and those contracts are becoming worthless anyway. What if we could buy them at a steep discount? That conversation launched the most intense 2 weeks of my life. Margaret assembled a legal team that looked like something out of a corporate thriller movie. We had environmental lawyers, water rights specialists, a forensic accountant, and even a former FBI agent who specialized in construction fraud. Henderson, my neighbor from the adjoining ranch, became our unofficial logistics coordinator. Tom's one of those guys who can fix anything with duct tape and determination, exactly the kind of ally you want when planning to take down a corrupt development company. The smell of welding smoke from his workshop became our planning session's unofficial soundtrack. Emma, meanwhile, had transformed into our social media strategist. Her TikTok following had grown to over 50,000 people invested in our story. She coordinated documentation efforts, managed our online narrative, and somehow kept her grades up while becoming an expert in property rights law. Sarah Mitchell, the local journalist who'd been covering our story fairly, agreed to investigate the broader corruption. Her newspaper series was already winning attention from larger media outlets, and she promised exclusive coverage of whatever we were planning. The legal strategy was multi-pronged and beautifully complex. First, we'd file a federal lawsuit for water rights violations, something that would trigger FBI investigation into Rick's business practices. Second, criminal referrals for trespassing and environmental damage would put personal pressure on both Rick and Patty. Third, ethics complaints against county officials would expose the corrupt permit approval process. But the financial plan was the real masterpiece. Margaret discovered that Rick's water utility contracts were being sold at massive discounts due to his company's financial troubles. Banks were quietly dumping these distressed assets to minimize their exposure to Rick's failing empire. Here's a knowledge nugget that could make you rich or broke. Distressed asset purchases require proof of your ability to perform the underlying obligations. You can't just buy someone's debt. You have to prove you can actually fulfill their contractual responsibilities better than they can. That's where my water rights became pure gold. I didn't just have the legal authority to control water access. I had a proven track record of sustainable water management going back 70 years. My grandfather's spring had never run dry, even during the worst droughts in Colorado history. The local bank, surprisingly, was eager to help. They'd been watching Rick's financial decline and were looking for a way to recover their loans without foreclosing on half the county. When I walked in with documentation proving I owned the actual water source, their loan officer's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Sarah's investigation uncovered a network of corruption that went far beyond my little property dispute. 3 other property owners were facing identical utility easement seizures. County officials were approving permits without proper environmental review. The state water board opened a formal investigation based on her reporting. Emma coordinated with other HOA victims across the state, building a coalition that would push for legislative reforms. Her documentation had become so thorough that legal advocacy groups were using our case as a model for property rights protection. The most satisfying part of our planning was discovering just how desperate Rick had become. His company was facing foreclosure on multiple projects. Contractors were filing liens faster than he could pay them off. 3 major investors had pulled out of deals citing regulatory uncertainty around water rights. Tom handled the technical logistics, installing flow meters to document exact water usage, setting up professional video equipment for the confrontation we knew was coming, coordinating with the sheriff's office for legal witness protection. The sound of his drill press working late into the night became our revolution's industrial symphony. We prepared compensation offers for every subdivision resident, individually calculated based on their property size and usage patterns. The goal wasn't to punish innocent homeowners, it was to give them better water security than Rick's failing company could provide. Margaret walked me through the community water cooperative model, a legal structure that would let subdivision residents own their water access collectively, with me as the primary supplier. Lower costs, better reliability, and local control instead of corporate extraction. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. Instead of destroying Rick's empire, we'd buy it out from under him. Instead of punishing subdivision residents, we'd give them better service. Instead of fighting corruption, we'd replace it with transparency. And as we put the finishing touches on our strategy, I realized we weren't just solving my property dispute. We were creating a model for how communities could protect themselves from predatory development practices. While we were quietly assembling our legal and financial arsenal, Patty was losing her mind trying to figure out why I'd suddenly gone silent. No more angry phone calls, no more courthouse confrontations, just an eerily calm rancher who seemed way too confident for someone supposedly losing a property dispute. Her desperation led to the most brazen move yet, a midnight visit to my front porch with a briefcase full of cash. "Jake," she said, her voice honey-sweet but shaking slightly, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Rick and I would like to offer you $500,000 for a permanent water easement. 500 grand, cash, sitting on my kitchen table at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The bills smelled crisp and new, like Rick had made a special trip to the bank. But I'd learned enough about negotiation to know that when someone shows up with emergency money, they're the one with the emergency. That's generous, Patty, but I'm not interested in selling." Her practiced smile cracked like cheap paint. "You don't understand the position you're in, Jake. We have legal authority, community support, and unlimited resources. This offer won't be on the table much longer." I poured myself coffee and let the silence stretch. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. When I didn't bite, Patty escalated to threats. The next morning, a fire inspector showed up, claiming the ranch posed significant wildfire risk to the subdivision. Apparently, my hay storage and equipment shed were now fire hazards, requiring immediate remediation or condemnation. The inspector, a nervous guy who kept checking his phone, took photos of everything that could possibly burn, which, on a working ranch, is basically everything. His preliminary report recommended emergency evacuation of livestock and cessation of agricultural operations pending compliance review. But here's where Patty's desperation started showing. She hired private security to patrol the subdivision borders. 3 guys in tactical gear started following my truck every time I left the ranch. Professional intimidation, suburban style. Rick, meanwhile, was spiraling toward financial panic. Margaret's forensic accountant had been tracking his company's cash flow, and the picture wasn't pretty. The bank had called in his $2,300,000 0-cents development loan early. 3 major subdivision projects were canceled due to water access uncertainty. His assets were getting frozen faster than ice cream in a blizzard. In his desperation, Rick tried selling his water utility contracts to out-of-state investors, but nobody wanted to buy rights to water they couldn't legally access. The taste of failure must have been bitter as burnt coffee. That's when Rick made his biggest mistake yet. Our trail cameras caught his crew attempting to poison my cattle's water supply with industrial chemicals. Not enough to kill them outright, just enough to make them sick and justify another environmental contamination investigation. The footage was crystal clear. 2 workers in Blackwood development uniforms dumping unmarked containers into my stock tanks at 3 a.m. When the sheriff arrived with a search warrant, they found the chemical containers still in the crew's truck, along with text messages from Rick ordering the sabotage. "Make it look like natural contamination," one message read. "Need justification for emergency seizure." Both workers were arrested on the spot. Rick claimed they were rogue employees acting without authorization, but the evidence showed he'd personally ordered the poisoning. Federal environmental crimes carry serious prison time, and suddenly Rick was facing 25 years behind bars. Meanwhile, Emma's social media documentation had exploded into mainstream attention. Her TikTok videos were being shared by environmental groups, property rights advocates, and anti-corruption activists. The hashtag #RanchVSOA was trending nationally, and major news networks were calling for interviews. The community pressure was building from unexpected directions. Local businesses were choosing sides in what had become a very public dispute. The coffee shop where our informal meetings happened started serving Jake's Justice Java. 3 restaurants banned Patty and Rick after their harassment tactics went public. But the real turning point came when subdivision residents started demanding answers about their water situation. Sarah's newspaper investigation had exposed Rick's financial problems, and homeowners were panicking about their property values. An informal group of residents requested a meeting with me directly, bypassing the HOA entirely. These weren't people who wanted to destroy my ranch. They were families who'd been lied to about their water rights and were looking for solutions. "We had no idea Rick was stealing your water," said Janet Morrison, a retired teacher whose husband worked for the county. "We thought we were buying legitimate water access." The smell of fear was stronger than the manure pile now, but it wasn't coming from my ranch. It was coming from a development company that had built an empire on lies and was watching it crumble under the weight of truth. With Rick facing federal charges and their empire crumbling, Patty made one last desperate gambit that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so dangerous. She called an emergency HOA meeting claiming I posed a terrorist threat to the subdivision. Yes, you heard that right. A cattle rancher fighting for his water rights was now apparently a domestic terrorist. The meeting notice, sent to all 847 households, described me as an armed extremist using illegal tactics to threaten community safety. She claimed my trail cameras were surveillance equipment, and my ranch equipment constituted a cache of dangerous weapons. I've got to admit, describing my 60-year-old hay baler as a weapon of mass destruction took some creative writing skills. But Patty's hysteria was starting to backfire spectacularly. Sarah's newspaper series had won a regional journalism award, drawing national attention to our David versus Goliath story. HOA reform advocates from across the country descended on our little corner of Colorado like reporters following a political scandal. The media war was intensifying daily. Local TV stations ran investigative pieces on development corruption. National networks picked up the story of a rancher fighting corporate land grabs. Emma's TikTok documentation was being shown in congressional hearings about property rights reform. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly completing the most satisfying purchase of my life. Margaret's negotiations had secured Rick's water utility contracts for $1,200,000, 0 cents, roughly half their face value. Banks were so eager to dump Rick's toxic assets that they practically paid us to take them off their hands. The legal ownership documents were beautiful things, crisp white paper, official seals, and the kind of language that meant I now controlled every drop of water flowing to Whispering Pines subdivision. The irony tasted sweeter than honey. The man who'd tried to steal my water had just sold me his own water rights. But Rick wasn't going down without a fight. FBI raids on his offices had uncovered a conspiracy that made our little property dispute look like small potatoes. Environmental crimes, bribery, fraud. His company was a criminal enterprise disguised as a development business. The corruption went deeper than anyone imagined. 3 other subdivision projects used identical illegal tactics. Fake environmental reports, bought permits, intimidation campaigns against neighboring property owners. Rick had turned land theft into a business model. Patty's personal meltdown was accelerating faster than a runaway truck on a mountain highway. Security cameras caught her screaming at elderly subdivision residents who dared to question HOA finances. Her racist comments toward my Hispanic ranch hands went viral within hours of being posted online. The HOA board, finally realizing they'd been led by a lunatic, voted to remove Patty as president. The vote wasn't even close, 6-1, with Patty casting the only vote for herself. Her husband Rick filed for divorce and bankruptcy protection the same week, leaving her to face the legal consequences alone. But the alliance supporting me had grown into something beautiful. 23 other HOA victims had joined our legal coalition. Environmental groups rallied around springwater conservation. Local businesses organized a Support Jake's Ranch campaign that brought customers from 3 counties. Sarah's investigation had triggered a state legislature response. The Rancher Protection Act was introduced with bipartisan support, specifically designed to prevent the kind of abuse my family had endured. When legislation gets named after your situation, you know you've made an impact. Emma's coming of age through this crisis had been remarkable to watch. She'd grown from a teenager documenting family drama into a nationally recognized advocate for property rights. Her testimony before the State Water Board was quoted in legal briefs across the western state. The technical preparation for our final confrontation was almost complete. Professional video equipment documented every gallon of water flowing from my spring to their subdivision. Legal papers were prepared for immediate service. The sheriff's department was briefed on potential violence from Patty's increasingly unhinged behavior. Here's the final knowledge nugget that won this whole war. When fighting institutional corruption, control the narrative by controlling the evidence. Documentation beats intimidation every single time. Truth has a way of surfacing, especially when you've got the cameras rolling. As I sat in my kitchen the night before our planned public confrontation, surrounded by legal documents that would change everything, I realized this had become about more than just my ranch. We were creating a blueprint for how small property owners could fight back against predatory development practices. The taste of anticipation mixed with the smell of fresh coffee, created a moment I'll never forget. Tomorrow, we'd find out if justice could still win in a system designed to favor money and power. The sound of Emma practicing her speech upstairs reminded me that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's building something better from the ashes of your enemy's mistakes. The county commissioner's emergency town hall meeting was supposed to address community water concerns, but everyone knew it was really about the war between a rancher and the most hated HOA president in Colorado history. 437 people packed into the high school gymnasium that Tuesday night. The air buzzed with anticipation thicker than summer humidity, mixed with the distinctive smell of school cafeteria disinfectant and nervous sweat from subdivision residents who'd finally learned the truth about their water situation. Sheriff's deputies were stationed at every entrance, not because they expected trouble from me, but because Patty had been making increasingly unhinged threats about protecting community interests by any means necessary. Emma had set up professional live streaming equipment, broadcasting to over 15,000 viewers online. National news crews occupied the back of the gym, their camera lights creating a Hollywood atmosphere in our little rural school. The commissioners tried maintaining order, but you could cut the tension with a butter knife. Subdivision residents sat on one side, ranch supporters on the other, with a nervous gap between them that spoke volumes about months of manufactured conflict. Commissioner Barbara Walsh called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. "We're here to address water rights disputes and find community solutions." That's when I stood up, walked to the microphone, and delivered the line I'd been practicing for weeks. Commissioners, community members, and especially the residents of Whispering Pines subdivision, I have an announcement that's going to change everything. The gymnasium fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the whir of camera equipment. You know that moment in movies when time seems to stop? This was that moment, but real. 3 months ago, Patricia Blackwood's husband started stealing water from my family's ranch through an illegal pipeline. They claimed legal authority they didn't have, harassed my family, poisoned my cattle, and tried to force me off land my grandfather bought in 1952. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Patty, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, looked like she was about to explode. But here's what the Blackwoods didn't know. What nobody knew until last week. I held up a thick stack of legal documents. I own the water rights to the entire underground source that feeds this region, not just my spring. The aquifer under their subdivision, their golf course, their fancy clubhouse, everything. The murmur became a roar. Subdivision residents turned to stare at each other in shock. Camera flashes popped like lightning. Furthermore, I continued, letting my voice carry over the noise, I've purchased all of Rick Blackwood's outstanding water utility contracts for $1.2 million. As of yesterday morning, I legally control every drop of water flowing to Whispering Pines subdivision. That's when Patty lost it completely. She jumped to her feet, pointing an accusatory finger like she was identifying a witch. This is extortion. He's holding our community hostage. Sheriff Deputy Martinez stepped forward as Patty advanced toward the microphone. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. I will not be silenced by some backwards rancher who thinks—" "Patricia Blackwood," Deputy Martinez interrupted, pulling out handcuffs. "You're under arrest for criminal trespassing, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and harassment." The crowd erupted as Patty was read her rights in front of 400 witnesses and national television cameras. The woman who terrorized a neighborhood for months was finally facing consequences for her actions. But I wasn't finished. As deputies escorted a screaming Patty toward the exit, I raised my hand for quiet. Now, before anyone panics about their water supply, I want to make something clear. I'm not here to punish innocent families who were lied to by the Blackwood Development Company. I pulled out another stack of papers. I'm proposing the formation of a community water cooperative. Every subdivision resident can purchase affordable, reliable water access through a collectively owned system. Lower costs than Rick was charging, better service, and local control instead of corporate extraction. The gymnasium atmosphere shifted from tension to hope. Subdivision residents started talking excitedly among themselves. Furthermore, I'm establishing a $300,000 environmental restoration fund to repair the damage caused by illegal pipeline construction. The spring will be protected under permanent conservation easement, ensuring clean water for generations. Standing ovation. 400 people on their feet, applauding not just for justice, but for a solution that helped everyone except the people who deserved punishment. FBI agent Sarah Williams stepped to a second microphone. I can also announce that Richard Blackwood has been arrested on federal charges including environmental crimes, fraud, and conspiracy. His company's assets have been frozen, and he's facing 25 years in federal prison. As I walked back to my seat, Emma hugged me tight enough to crack ribs. Margaret smiled like a lawyer who just won the case of her career. Tom grinned and gave me a thumbs up that meant more than any fancy award. Justice tastes better than victory, and it feels even better when you can share it with your community. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my front porch watching the 3rd annual Spring Festival unfold across what used to be a battlefield. 2,000 people have come to celebrate water conservation, sustainable ranching, and the kind of community cooperation that emerges when you remove toxic leadership. The immediate aftermath of that town hall meeting was sweeter than my grandmother's apple pie. 89% of subdivision residents voted to join our water cooperative within 2 weeks. Property values stabilized once people realized they had better water security than ever before. The $400,000 0-cent settlement fund has transformed damaged ranch land into a wildlife habitat that draws visitors from 3 states. Rick Blackwood got 12 years in federal prison and $8,200,000 0 cents in restitution orders. Turns out, environmental crimes carry serious penalties when you can't buy your way out of consequences. Patty divorced him, declared bankruptcy, and moved to Florida, where she's working retail under her maiden name. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. The personal healing has been just as satisfying as the legal victories. Emma's college fund is fully endowed thanks to water cooperative profits. My custody arrangement with my ex-wife stabilized once she realized the ranch was actually a stable, profitable operation. And Sarah, the journalist who helped expose this corruption, moved in with us last year after a romance that bloomed over late-night strategy sessions and shared outrage at injustice. The community benefits extend far beyond our little corner of Colorado. The annual Spring Festival raises money for environmental education and provides scholarships for rural students studying sustainable agriculture. School groups tour the ranch to learn about water conservation and property rights. We've become an unlikely model for how communities can protect themselves from predatory development. Emma graduated as valedictorian and accepted a full scholarship to Colorado State's Environmental Science program. Her TikTok account has evolved into an educational platform with over 200,000 followers learning about rural issues and environmental law. She's planning to return to the ranch after graduation with a degree in sustainable agriculture and enough legal knowledge to keep the next generation of land grabbers honest. The broader impact has exceeded our wildest dreams. Jake's Law passed the state legislature with bipartisan support, protecting agricultural operations from HOA overreach across Colorado. 37 other states have introduced similar legislation. The National Property Rights Foundation uses our case as a model for fighting institutional corruption. Margaret established the Grandfather's Spring Foundation with initial funding from our legal settlement. The foundation provides free legal aid for small property owners facing development pressure, hosts annual conferences on sustainable water management, and maintains a scholarship program for rural students studying environmental law. The legacy project I'm most proud of is educational. We host workshops teaching people how to research property rights, document harassment, and navigate legal systems designed to favor wealth over justice. Knowledge nuggets that seemed overwhelming to me 3 years ago are now accessible to any property owner willing to learn. Last month, Emma announced her engagement to David Chen, Margaret's nephew, who's finishing law school with a focus on environmental justice. They're planning a wedding at the Spring next summer, surrounded by the community that supported us through the darkest chapter of our lives. The 3rd annual Spring Festival feels like a celebration of more than just water conservation. Families who used to live in fear of HOA retaliation now volunteer together on environmental projects. Former subdivision enemies have become ranch hands and close friends. Children who grew up during the conflict are now teenagers who understand the importance of standing up to bullies, whether they wear suits or carry clipboards. As I watch Emma give a speech about water rights to a packed crowd, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's building something so much better that their corruption becomes irrelevant. The smell of barbecue smoke mingles with spring water mist, creating the kind of sensory memory that will last forever. The sound of children laughing where heavy machinery used to roar feels like the sweetest victory of all. So here's my challenge to you. If you've got an HOA nightmare story, share it in the comments below. Document everything, research your rights, and remember that bullies count on you staying silent and isolated. And if this story inspired you to stand up to corrupt systems in your own community, hit that subscribe button. Because next week, I'm telling you about how a small-town librarian used environmental law to shut down a megachurch's illegal waste dumping operation. Trust me, you won't believe what she found buried in that church parking lot.